My name is Kinnan. I'm the principal investigator of the Detrans Canada research study. And this is Gabriel Nshuga. Gabriel can introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Nshuga. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm a research assistant on the project.
So we'll be presenting to you a new typology for understanding different detransition pathways and also how that relates to identity. Our study is funded by SSHRC, and this is our full research team. As you can see, there's a lot of us, and we're very interdisciplinary situated, and we're across Canada, and also one of us is in the US as well. Before talking about the research, we wanted to share our entry point into this work. So Gabriel and I are both trans, and we're from the same tiny town in Nova Scotia. We've known each other for 17 years, and we transitioned within a few years of each other. And over the years, we've had a few people in our own personal networks who have detransitioned. And we think that understanding this experience is really important, and that the current model of gender care really needs to adapt in order to acknowledge and address the needs of people who detransition. Detransition is defined as stopping or reversing a gender transition. And more recently, researchers studying detransition tend to reserve this term to also demarcate a change in identity has also occurred since the initial gender transition. So detransition often involves stopping or switching gender-affirming hormones, surgical reconstructions, or sometimes just electing against interventions that were once expressly desired. Some people take issue with the language of detransition, but we use the word detransition because we are community-engaged researchers, and we know that this language is very important to the way that people understand themselves, communicate their experiences and their care needs. So detransition and detrans is also emerging language that some people may be becoming familiar with. So someone who identifies as a detrans lesbian may have a history of being a trans man. Someone who would label themselves as detrans and male may have lived as a trans woman for a period of time. Someone who's detrans and non-binary probably had a binary transition and now they've re-identified as non-binary. But importantly, detrans doesn't necessarily indicate an identity, but more so an experiential process and having lived as a trans person for a period of time. So how often does discontinuation of transition or detransition occur? I'm going to share a really quick snapshot of a few of the recent studies that have been published in the last couple of years. I just want to say a quick note, though, that these studies are very limited due to methodological shortcomings. Oops, go back. So the first two on the screen here are both studies that relied on healthcare administrative data looking at gender-affirming hormone continuation rates or discontinuation rates. So one study in the US found in a sample of young trans people, average age 19, found about a 30% discontinuation rate within 4 years. Using very similar methodology, a new study just out in the Netherlands found a 2% discontinuation rate. And what the main difference between these two studies is that in the Dutch sample, all of these participants actually started out on puberty blockers. Importantly, though, from this study design, we actually don't know the reasons for discontinuation or whether any identity shift has occurred. In England, 3 studies were published fairly recently, estimating the frequency of detransition with an explicit change in identity following gender care to be roughly 6.9% to 9.8%. Now, the last figure here on the slide, this is hot off the press from a colleague of many of ours, Dr. Travis Salway at Simon Fraser University, just conducted the Unicorn Survey, And so he included in the sample is a sample of 774 young trans people. They're in Canada and the United States, average age 21, who had initiated gender-affirming medical treatments, and 16% reported stopping or reversing those treatments. And the most frequently reported reasons were health concerns, change in identity, gender identity, and cost. So those were the three major factors. So we're still working on doing like a regression analysis to look at comparing those who continued and discontinued. So stay tuned for that. The important point, though, about those studies is that they don't really tell us much about the experiences or the care needs of people who detransition. So there's two typologies that are currently available. One is looking at detransition with or without regret. Some people detransition with significant regrets. Some people don't have many regrets about the initial transition. So this focuses more on feelings about the body and the initial transition process and how people feel about that and potentially support needs. A second typology that's available is called core and non-core detransition. So this is demarcated by identity shifts and whether someone still identifies under the transgender umbrella. So in a core detransition, someone discontinues or reverses their transition and also re-identifies with their birth assigned sex or gender. So they don't identify as trans or non-binary anymore. In a non-core detransition, people may still identify as trans or non-binary, or they may shift from a binary trans identity to non-binary, and they're also discontinuing as well. So to develop a new typology to understand discrete detransition pathways, we asked, what are the identities and experiences of people who detransition? And I'm going to turn it over to Gabriel now, who will talk about our study methodology. Here you go, Gabriel.
Perfect. Thanks, Kenan. All right. So to answer this question, we employed a methodological approach called constructivist grounded theory, and this is a critical approach to qualitative research. Within constructivist grounded theory, reflexivity is very important. So due to our lived experiences as trans people, we had to reflect a lot on our own prior assumptions about detransition, and we also consulted with several detransitioners throughout the study. So to invite participants, the study flyer was circulated on social media to clinicians practicing in 6 urban centers and also within participants' social networks among detrans communities. We were contacted by 45 individuals during the recruitment process, and we conducted in-depth virtual interviews with 28 participants who met our eligibility criteria. And eligible participants were Canadian residents aged 18 and older who experienced stopping, shifting, or reversing a gender transition. The interviews ranged in length between about 50 to 90 minutes. They were recorded and transcribed, and participants were asked various questions about their experiences with transitioning, as well as detransitioning, and also their experiences with care providers. Following constructivist grounded theory, the interview data was analyzed inductively and thematically using the constant comparative method of data analysis. So who were our participants? As you can see from our demographic data, the majority of participants were between the ages of 20 to 29 years old. 64% were assigned female at birth. The majority identified as white, with 18% identifying as multiracial. Almost all of the participants identified within the 2S LGBTQ community, and 57% identified as having a disability, with the majority of these participants indicating a mental health-related disability. Among participants as well, the mean duration of time between social transition to detransition was 5.32 years. The majority of participants accessed medical transition before the age of 24 years old, and a majority also indicated having 3 or more past identities. almost all of the participants started out on a binary transition pathway, initially identifying as trans men or trans women. But by the time of the interview, many of the participants were re-identifying as non-binary. Others detransitioned to identify with their birth, sex, or gender. So what did we learn from our participants? Through the narrative data, we found 4 detransition pathways. The first is discrimination and trans identity dissociation. So some participants describe detransitioning due to lack of support or employment-related discrimination. It's also important to note that these narratives occurred almost exclusively among the trans feminine participants or participants who were assigned male at birth. These participants described repressing or disassociating from their trans identity during the time of detransition, and some would also later retransition when it felt safer for them to do so. So I want to share a quote. This is from participant 24. They're 20 years old and they identify as a trans woman. So they said, "Well, right after, I guess is a weird shock. I was just trying to repress any feelings I had. I was generally trying to be their perfect son. I tried to just make myself into this portrait of a guy that I had in my mind of what a man should be, and tried to repress anything that made me think of transition. I mostly tried to study until I fell down and just drowned myself with that. College was starting, so that was pretty intensive at the time. I would try to disassociate like I did before coming out." Another prominent theme that emerged from the data was that some participants discontinued hormones due to negative physical or mental health impacts that were thought to be related to gender-affirming hormones. Some participants described unwanted physical changes or even a new form of gender dysphoria. Participants detransitioned to improve their health, to reduce health risks, or to prevent further changes from happening. And this seemed to trigger a shift in identity, with some participants re-identifying as non-binary or a new queer, for some participants re-identifying with their birth sex or a new queer or trans identity. So this is from participant 17. They're age 32, and they identify as gender fluid male. So they said, "After gender confirmation surgeries, having been on hormones is not the right fit. I'm still queer, but I do present as male, and I'm okay with male pronouns. I might have to start taking testosterone to deal with some of these negative symptoms, and that'll have masculinizing effects. I think it was especially after the orchiectomy, I had this realization that there's no pure detransitioning for me anymore. I viewed it as, well, my gender is kind of open to me, and it's something that I can take in different ways." So now I will turn it over to Kinnan, who will present the remaining typologies.
Thanks, Gabriel. So many of the participants in our study reported a latent discovery of non-binary identity years after starting out on a binary transition trajectory. They felt that their initial transition was ultimately not right for them, and they speculated that it was socially influenced by the cultural milieu of the time, or even that they were coerced into a binary transition by the trans medical system itself. So they re-identified as non-binary, discontinued hormones, and didn't pursue any further interventions. Participant 13, who's 25 now, says, "At 14, I didn't know anything about being trans other than what the doctors and cisgender specialists were telling me. They were living in a group home at the time. I think if I transition in this day and age and not 11 years ago, if transition wasn't presented to me the way it was, I would have held off on the testosterone. And I think I would have always explored my gender and always identified as trans. But I don't know if I'd be this masculine if I didn't alter my body in a way where I can only really exist. I'm always going to be treated as more masculine. I was socialized as male at the age of 14. I had a male socialization for a long time, and I don't think I can undo all of that. The final detransition pathway is discontinuation and socially mediated detransition. This theme was found particularly among the AFAB transmasculine spectrum participants. They began to engage with detrans community, particularly at a time when they wanted to stop and were feeling a lot of dissatisfaction in their gender transition. So they explained that hearing detransitioned women's stories impacted them and the way they understood themselves and their sex and their sexuality, gender, and also often experiences of trauma. They found alternative explanations to make sense of their feelings outside of dominant transgender discourses. When I first started thinking about it, I just thought, I'll keep living the way I am, a trans man, but I won't be on T anymore. I just Googled FTM stopping testosterone, and Reddit and YouTube videos popped up. And then when I saw that there were women who actually detransition, I was just like, wow, you can do this? Hearing some of the women's stories, I just was like, wow, I can relate to this a lot. Because I'm a lesbian, and especially the women that are lesbians, I could just relate to. And there's a couple women that also went through sexual abuse. It really overwhelmed me and scared me to think about regretting it. I joined a Detrans Facebook group, but I just sat back and I just listened to what other people have to say. Participants in the sample detransitioned due to a confluence of different factors, such as discrimination, health challenges, and because their understanding of their identity changed, or because they were unhappy in their new gender role in society. So these narratives offer us the opportunity to rethink the cisgender, transgender binary, and also reconsider our care practices. Detransition experiences exist in a much more liminal space. And each of these pathways to detransition may require individualized care and more research. So it's very difficult to predict how gender-affirming medical or surgical interventions will be experienced by individuals because our bodies and our identities interact with the social environment, and as we go through different life experiences, this can change. So more research is needed to examine and understand different pathways to detransition. Changes in self-conceptualized identity after transitioning does occur for some people. Detransition and or regret happens often between a range of months to greater than 10 years. Some of the most recent studies published recently seem to show about 3.5 to 5.5 years with detransition occurring. Detransition is often a socially, medically, and psychologically challenging process, and care provider avoidance is very common due to shame and fear of clinician judgment. One study found that only 24% of respondents told their clinic or their provider that they had detransitioned. And this is really important because if people are avoiding care, then we really miss out on a lot of opportunity to learn through clinical interactions, and people are not getting the care that they need. So I'll end with a few recommendations. It's really important to discuss with people who are contemplating transition that changes in identity do occur for some people, and this can affect satisfaction with interventions, because if someone's identity changes over time, past gender-affirming medical or surgical interventions may not be affirming. So explore this. What might detransition look or feel like? And explore individualized care needs. We showed 4 different detransition pathways. Each one of those may warrant different care. Detransition is complex and often isolating. People may lose community supports. Some may feel mistrust toward healthcare providers and the healthcare system itself. And also grief or mourning about permanent changes that have been made to the body by gender-affirming intervention. So all of this may need to be worked through. We really, really need 2S LGBTQ+ inclusive support programs, especially peer support for people who are questioning their gender transition and or detransitioning, and we need these services now. Quick limitations. This is an exploratory qualitative study of detransition in Canada. It's a cross-sectional design, therefore results are not generalizable to all detrans or detransitioning people or trans people. There may be additional pathways to detransition, and experiences of transition and detransition are very heterogeneous. We have unique stories and life experiences. Thank you all, especially to our 28 participants who trusted us with their stories. Thanks.